Eduardo Martinez looked out from the window of his executive office on the 32nd floor of Mexico City's tallest corporate building, contemplating the chaotic traffic that stretched for miles in all directions while reflecting on the irony that his billion-peso wealth afforded him a privileged view of the city but could not erase the lingering sense of emotional emptiness that had characterized his last 5 years, ever since his wife Elena had died of cancer, leaving him alone with an immense fortune but no family and no purpose beyond the continued accumulation of wealth he no longer particularly needed or enjoyed. "Mr. Martinez, your 3 o'clock meeting has been cancelled," his assistant Patricia announced through the intercom, unexpectedly freeing up an afternoon that he would normally have filled with business negotiations or financial reviews that took up time but provided none of the genuine satisfaction he had once found in building a business empire from humble beginnings as an insurance salesman working 18-hour days to support a young family. The sudden availability of a free afternoon created an inexplicable impulse to abandon the steel and glass tower that had symbolized his professional success but that increasingly felt like an elegant prison, isolating him from ordinary human experiences he vaguely remembered from earlier decades when the struggle for economic survival had provided a clarity of purpose that wealth had paradoxically eroded. "Patricia, I'm going out for the rest of the day," he decided spontaneously as he grabbed a jacket and left behind his cell phone that normally kept him constantly connected to the web of corporate obligations and investment opportunities. "I'm not sure when I'll be back, so cancel any commitments for tomorrow as well if necessary." His impulsive decision to disconnect from the structured routine that had defined his days for years reflected a growing unease about meaning and purpose that he hadn't clearly articulated even to himself but that was propelling him toward something different from the established patterns of his current existence. The streets of downtown Mexico City that he explored on foot for the next few hours provided him with an immersion in urban reality that he normally experienced only through the windows of chauffeur-driven cars, efficiently shuttling him between important locations without exposure to the mundane textures of life that millions of city dwellers navigated daily. Street vendors hawking tacos and elotes, buskers seeking tips, mothers carrying young children while shopping in crowded markets, all represented dimensions of human experience from which his wealth had progressively insulated him in ways he was only now beginning to recognize as a significant loss rather than a desirable privilege envied by others from positions of lesser material prosperity. The small corner cafe in a working-class neighborhood that Eduardo wandered into almost by accident when a sudden downpour caught him without an umbrella offered a modest atmosphere that contrasted dramatically with the upscale restaurants where he typically dined with business associates who discussed multimillion-dollar transactions over dishes prepared by award-winning chefs whose culinary creativity impressed intellectually, without providing the simple visceral satisfaction that honest food, shared in a humble setting, could generate. "Welcome, sir. Please sit wherever you like," offered a female voice from the small kitchen visible behind a counter where a handwritten chalkboard announced the daily menu, with prices that Eduardo recognized as extraordinarily affordable by Mexico City standards, although they likely represented minimal profit margins for a small operation that clearly operated with limited resources. The woman who emerged, wiping her hands on her apron while smiling with a genuine warmth that expensive restaurants rarely managed to replicate despite extensive professional training of their waitstaff, was approximately 35 years old, with tired eyes that suggested responsibilities that exceeded the simple management of a modest cafe, and a posture that communicated dignity despite obviously challenging circumstances. "Thank you, a coffee please," Eduardo ordered as he sat at a table near the window where he could watch the rain that had transformed the dusty street into a temporary river that pedestrians navigated by jumping through puddles while street vendors protected their merchandise with makeshift plastic sheets that demonstrated ingenuity born of economic necessity. "Of course. Would you like to try our sweet bread as well? I baked it this morning and it's still fresh," the woman suggested, evident pride in her culinary creation, which represented personal skill rather than the corporate brand or celebrity chef reputation Eduardo typically associated with worthy dining experiences. The authenticity of her offerings and complete lack of pretense in their presentation created a refreshing contrast to the calculated sophistication of establishments where he typically consumed meals that impressed more than nourished. "I'd love to try your sweet bread," Eduardo agreed as he observed simple cafe decor, including family photographs on cheerfully painted walls that communicated care and attention despite obvious budget constraints, creating a welcoming atmosphere that expensive interior designers working on their commercial properties rarely manage to capture despite virtually unlimited resources for materials and labor. The coffee she served moments later had a robust flavor that reflected careful bean selection and attentive preparation rather than the industrial processing of corporate chains, while freshly baked sweet bread provided simple pleasure that elaborate desserts at high-end restaurants frequently fail to generate due to excessive complexity that obscured fundamental flavors that humble cooking could highlight through honest simplicity. "This is delicious," Eduardo commented genuinely as the woman cleared a nearby table with an efficiency that suggested years of practice in keeping a small establishment running with limited resources and help. "How long have you had this cafe?" "Approximately 3 years," she replied with a smile that mixed pride with tacit recognition of the challenges a small operation faced in a city where competition was fierce and profit margins were slim even for well-established businesses with adequate capital. "My name is Carmen Ruiz, and this coffee shop represents a dream I had for years while working in other people's restaurants until I finally saved enough to rent this small space and start my own business, although I admit that some months it is difficult to cover all the expenses between rent, ingredients, and services while also supporting my 9-year-old daughter as a single mother." Her disclosure of personal circumstances was shared without self-pity or solicitation of sympathy but as factual context that explained both her commitment to her business and the limitations she faced in trying to build a viable enterprise while fulfilling parental responsibilities without the support of a partner who could share the financial and emotional burden. Eduardo felt an unexpected connection with Carmen's story, which resonated with his own memories of struggling to establish a business decades earlier, when he and Elena had worked tirelessly to build a financial future that eventually exceeded their wildest dreams but had required years of sacrifice and determination in the face of obstacles that seemed insurmountable in times of greater challenge. "I can see that you put a lot of care into what you do," he observed as he studied the cafe's details that revealed conscious attention to customer experience despite limited resources, from fresh flowers on each table to the soft music that created a welcoming atmosphere without being intrusive. "How did you decide to open your own business instead of continuing to work for others where income would have been more predictable, albeit limited?" His question reflected genuine curiosity about the motivations that drove entrepreneurship in circumstances where financial risk was significant and the likelihood of success was statistically bleak, according to studies showing that the majority of small businesses failed within their first 5 years. "I wanted to create something of my own that I could pass on to my daughter," Carmen explained as she poured fresh coffee unprompted by Eduardo, a gesture of generous hospitality that reflected values about service that transcended purely commercial calculation. "And to show her that with hard work and determination it is possible to build a dignified life even when you start out without significant resources or connections to facilitate your path. Because I believe the most important lessons we can teach our children come from personal example rather than just words about values we profess but don't actually live." Her philosophy of parenting and role modeling resonated deeply with Eduardo, who recalled similar lessons his own parents had taught by example during his childhood in modest economic circumstances that had shaped his character in ways that later affluence had never fundamentally altered despite dramatic changes in material lifestyle. The conversation that unfolded over the next hour as the rain continued outside and other customers occasionally came in to order coffee or takeout revealed that Carmen was a widow whose husband had died in a construction accident 2 years earlier, leaving her with significant medical bills and no adequate life insurance that could provide financial security for her and her daughter during the adjustment period to the devastating loss. The crisis that led to this transformative moment for both of them began when Carmen excused herself to take an urgent phone call in the kitchen. And Eduardo could overhear snatches of a tense conversation about late rent payment that her landlord was demanding immediately under threat of eviction that would force the cafe's closure if not resolved within 48 hours according to the terms of a lease that apparently allowed no flexibility for tenants facing temporary financial hardship. "I'm so sorry, sir," Carmen apologized when she returned, her eyes moist, suggesting she had been briefly crying in the privacy of the kitchen while processing the stress of a financial situation that threatened to destroy the business she had built through years of work and personal sacrifice. "That was my landlord informing me that I must pay 3 months of back rent plus current rent within 2 days or I will have to vacate this space. And I honestly don't know how I'm going to come up with 60,000 pesos in such a short time when my savings are depleted after unexpected repairs to the kitchen equipment last month." Her admission of financial crisis was shared with the stranger because she apparently needed to articulate the situation out loud in order to process it emotionally, and because Eduardo had shown genuine interest in her story, creating a safe space for vulnerability she might not normally have shared with a casual client. Eduardo felt an immediate impulse to offer financial assistance that would instantly solve Carmen's problem. Given that 60,000 pesos represented a trivial amount for someone of her wealth, equivalent to what she thoughtlessly spent on individual business lunches or bottles of wine she casually ordered at restaurants where she dined with business associates. However, he recognized that a direct offer of charity might offend Carmen's dignity, as she clearly valued independence and self-sufficiency as fundamental principles defining her personal and professional identity. This required a more delicate approach that respected her pride while providing practical assistance she desperately needed to avoid imminent economic disaster. "Carmen, I have a proposal that may help with your immediate situation." Eduardo began carefully as he formulated an improvised plan that would provide assistance without compromising the dignity of a woman who had deeply impressed him with his determination and character. "I am in a position to loan you the 60,000 pesos you need to satisfy your landlord's demands, and you can repay me when your financial situation improves, without interest or a fixed payment schedule that would create additional pressure during a period when you need to concentrate on making your business successful instead of worrying about debts accruing interest." His offer was deliberately structured as a loan rather than a gift in order to preserve Carmen's dignity while providing the immediate financial relief she needed to prevent the loss of a business that represented her livelihood and personal dream. "I can't accept that," Carmen immediately responded, her expression revealing both gratitude for the offer and an instinctive reluctance to accept charity from a stranger no matter how desperate their situation. "I don't even know who you really are, and I have no way of guaranteeing that I'll be able to repay you given that my financial situation is precarious even under the best of circumstances, so it would be irresponsible of me to accept a loan that I may never be able to repay without compromising my daughter's needs." "I completely understand your reservations," Eduardo replied as he took a checkbook from his jacket and began to write a check for 60,000 pesos with a growing determination to help regardless of Carmen's objections because he had recognized in her qualities of character and determination that deserved support rather than being defeated by economic circumstances that were no fault of her own. "But allow me to explain why I am making this offer and why you should seriously consider it. Before rejecting it out of understandable pride, which I respect but should not prevent you from accepting assistance that could prevent the loss of business that obviously means a lot to you and your daughter." His tone was firm but respectful as he tried to overcome Carmen's natural resistance to accepting assistance that violated her sense of self-sufficiency that she had cultivated since her husband's death when circumstances had forced her to rely solely on herself for the survival and well-being of her family. "My full name is Eduardo Martinez, and I own Inversions Cordillera, which you may have heard mentioned in the news occasionally." He revealed his identity with calculated deliberation to provide context that would explain both his financial capacity to make the loan and his motivations, which went beyond simple philanthropy to a personal connection with Carmen's story and admiration for her determination to build an independent business despite formidable obstacles. The recognition in Carmen's expression confirmed that she had heard of his company, although she had probably never imagined that a billionaire whose fortune was regularly reported in the financial media would be sitting in his modest coffee shop, sipping coffee and offering to solve his rent crisis with a personal check that represented a microscopic fraction of his personal wealth. "Mr. Martinez, I don't know what to say," Carmen stammered as she processed the revelation that she had been casually serving coffee to one of the richest people in Mexico without any idea of his identity because his appearance and demeanor had communicated no obvious signs of extraordinary wealth she typically associated with the business elite. "Why would you want to help someone like me when you don't even know me and when 60,000 pesos is probably such a paltry amount to you that you won't even notice its absence from your bank account?" Her question articulated genuine confusion about the motivations that would drive someone with virtually unlimited resources to become personally involved in the financial woes of a single mother struggling to maintain a small coffee shop in a working-class neighborhood that was as distant from her personal circumstances as it was possible to imagine. "Because 30 years ago I was in exactly her position," Eduardo explained with emotion, which he had been suppressing for years since Elena's death but which Carmen's story had triggered by reminding him of a period in his life when determination and hard work had been the only resources he had to build a better future. Struggling to build a small business with limited resources while trying to support a young family, and wondering if I would ever achieve financial security that would eliminate constant anxiety over bills and obligations that exceeded the precarious income of a developing business. Her disclosure of their shared past of economic hardship provided emotional context that made her offer more personal than transactional, while establishing a connection based on common experiences that transcended actual differences in wealth and social status. "And because when I was in that desperate position," Eduardo continued as he extended a completed check to Carmen with a hand that trembled slightly with emotion he hadn't experienced in years of calculated business transactions that had lost the ability to generate genuine feelings beyond the intellectual satisfaction of successful negotiations. "A man named Don Rafael Sanchez lent me money without guarantees or interest when a bank had rejected my loan request because they considered my business too risky for a safe investment. And his generosity literally saved my company, which would have collapsed without that injection of capital that gave me time to consolidate operations and establish a stable financial base." His story of a benefactor who had changed his life's trajectory through a leap of faith in the potential of a young entrepreneur who had nothing but determination and an ambitious business plan provided precedent for his own offer to Carmen, while revealing that his current wealth had not been built solely through individual effort but had critically depended on the generosity of another who had seen potential where formal financial institutions had seen only unacceptable risk. "Don Rafael told me something I'll never forget when I thanked him profusely and asked how I could ever adequately repay him for his trust in me," Eduardo recounted, tears beginning to form in his eyes for the first time since Elena's funeral. "He told me that the best way to repay him would be to help someone else in a similar situation when I was in a position to do so, passing the generosity along rather than simply returning it to him, thereby creating a chain of mutual aid that would multiply the impact of his original act of kindness in ways that exceeded any benefit that direct repayment could provide." The paying it forward philosophy his mentor had articulated had resonated with Eduardo for decades, though he admittedly failed to implement it consistently during the years of frenzied wealth accumulation that consumed his attention following Don Rafael's untimely death before Eduardo could fully repay him or adequately thank him for the faith he had shown at a critical moment. "So when I ask you to accept this check," Eduardo concluded as he placed a document on the table between them with a gesture that communicated both the seriousness of his offer and respect for Carmen's autonomy to make the final decision on acceptance, "I'm not being charitable in the condescending sense but rather fulfilling an obligation I've neglected for too long since achieving financial success, which caused me to forget the lessons about community and mutual responsibility that Don Rafael tried to teach me through his generous example." His reframing of the offer as a fulfillment of a moral obligation rather than an optional act of charity provided a framework that might allow Carmen to accept assistance without feeling she was compromising her independence or becoming an object of pity that violated the dignity she had carefully maintained during years of financial struggle. "And to be completely honest," he added with a smile that held both sadness and hope, Your story and this cafe have reminded me of something I'd lost during years of chasing wealth I no longer need. A sense of purpose and human connection that money can't buy but ironically can facilitate when used in ways that build community rather than simply accumulating in bank accounts that earn interest but lack existential meaning. Carmen took the check with trembling hands as tears streamed freely down her cheeks in response both to the immediate financial relief it represented and to the emotional story Eduardo had shared about his own early struggle and the generous mentor whose philosophy of mutual aid was now being passed down through generations of beneficiaries whose lives were being transformed by acts of faith into human potential. Mr. Martinez, I have no words to express what this means to me and my daughter, she said, her voice cracking with emotion she had been holding back for months of mounting stress over a financial situation that had threatened to destroy a business that represented not only sustenance but also the dream and purpose that had sustained her spirit during the dark period following her husband's death. But I need you to understand that while I accept this loan with gratitude that I cannot adequately articulate, I am absolutely committed to repaying you every peso when my situation improves. Because my word and my integrity are all I truly possess beyond this modest cafe and my precious daughter. Her insistence on repayment obligations reflected principles of personal honor and financial responsibility that Eduardo recognized as exactly the kind of character that had driven his decision to help in the first place, validating his judgment that Carmen deserved support not only out of need but also for personal qualities that suggested her business would eventually prosper if given a chance to overcome a temporary crisis. Then we have an agreement, Eduardo responded as he extended a hand to seal the commitment with a handshake that communicated mutual respect and trust that transcended financial transactions to create a human bond that both recognized as significant beyond the monetary value of the loan itself. And please call me Eduardo instead of Mr. Martinez, because I hope this is not the last time we see each other but rather the beginning of a friendship that could enrich my life as much as I hope my financial assistance helps stabilize yours. His expression of interest in an ongoing relationship rather than a one-time transaction surprised Carmen but resonated with her own sense that meeting this stranger who happened to be a multimillionaire had a quality of destiny or purpose that exceeded the random coincidence of taking shelter from the rain in a particular coffee shop on a specific afternoon. I promise I will pay you when I can, Eduardo, Carmen said with a fierce determination that transformed a simple promise into a sacred vow that would define her purpose for years to come. Even if it takes years because my business grows slowly, I will keep careful record of this debt and honor it fully because that is how my mother taught me that decent people behave when others demonstrate faith in them during times of greatest need. Her commitment was expressed with an intensity that communicated that repayment would not just be a financial transaction but a validation of her character and a demonstration that Eduardo's trust had been justified by his personal integrity, which would not allow an obligation to be forgotten or dismissed simply because the lender had resources that made repayment financially unnecessary. Eduardo felt excitement he had not experienced since the early days of his marriage to Elena, when they had shared dreams and struggles that had united their lives in a common purpose that later wealth had never replicated despite the material comforts it provided. He recognized that his encounter with Carmen had awakened something dormant in his spirit, which years of entrepreneurial success had gradually extinguished through isolation from ordinary human experiences that gave texture and meaning to life beyond the accumulation of abstract wealth. The following months brought dramatic transformation in both Carmen's circumstances and Eduardo's life. Eduardo had found in their growing friendship an antidote to the loneliness that had characterized his years since Elena's death, when he had buried his grief in compulsive work that generated money but provided no emotional solace or existential satisfaction. Carmen's cafe flourished after the rent crisis was resolved, with new customers discovering the establishment through word-of-mouth referrals who praised both the quality of the food and the welcoming atmosphere that Carmen had cultivated through careful attention to details that created a memorable experience rather than just a routine business transaction. Eduardo became a regular visitor, arriving several times a week for morning coffee, which provided a pretext for conversations that enriched their days through a genuine human connection not dependent on wealth or status but on shared interests and mutual respect that had grown from the initial encounter forged in a moment of crisis and vulnerability. "My daughter Sophia wants to meet you," Carmen mentioned one day while serving coffee with a smile that suggested something significant was about to be revealed. "Because I've told her about the generous man who saved her mother's business and because she's writing a school essay about people who have influenced her life in positive ways. And I believe that your story about Don Rafael and his philosophy of paying it forward would be a valuable lesson for her on how to live with integrity and responsibility to her community." Her invitation to meet his daughter represented a level of trust and acceptance in their friendship that touched Eduardo deeply because he recognized that Carmen was allowing him into the most private and important aspect of her life when many single mothers would have maintained protective barriers between adult personal relationships and their children. The meeting with Sophia, arranged for the following Saturday when she was out of school, revealed her to be an intelligent and curious child who had inherited her mother's determination and character, along with an enthusiasm for learning that reminded Eduardo of his own daughter, who had died in infancy of a congenital disease years before. Her entrepreneurial success had made possible advanced medical treatments that might have saved her life had they been accessible during a period when limited resources had forced impossible decisions about prioritizing family expenses. "Mr. Eduardo, my mother says you are a very successful man who started with nothing. Just like her," Sophia said with the direct candor that characterized children who had not yet learned social filters on appropriate topics of conversation. "Is it difficult to be rich when you remember what it was like to be poor like we were before you helped us?" Her question tapped directly into the tension Eduardo had been navigating for decades between the memory of humble origins and the reality of the extraordinary privilege that transformations of fortune had created, forcing him to articulate reflection he had rarely shared, even with himself, during years of increasing distance from his working-class roots. "It's complicated, Sophia," Eduardo responded honestly as he considered how to explain the existential complexities of extreme wealth to a 9-year-old without sounding condescending or self-pitying given that her emotional issues were incomparably trivial compared to the material challenges Carmen and Sophia faced daily. "Because money solves many practical problems, but it doesn't eliminate questions of purpose and meaning that we all face regardless of bank account. And sometimes I think I was happier when I was struggling alongside your mom is struggling now because I had clarity about what I needed to accomplish, whereas now I have the resources to do almost anything, but I'm not sure what I should do that would be worth it." The friendship that deepened over the next year provided Eduardo with a connection to authentic life that had been absent during decades of isolation in elite circles where relationships were frequently transactional and where genuine vulnerability was rarely expressed due to the competitiveness and social positioning that characterized interactions between wealthy individuals protecting themselves from exploitation or manipulation by those who might benefit from their resources. Carmen and Sophia provided a refreshing contrast through unfiltered honesty about their struggles and aspirations, not calculated to impress or extract favors but shared as a natural expression of authentic friendship that valued human connection over material advantage. "I've been thinking about your comment about Don Rafael and the responsibility of paying it forward," Carmen mentioned during one of their frequent conversations while Sophia did homework at a nearby table. "And I'm wondering if there's a way I could do something similar even from my position of very limited resources, because although I don't have money to lend to others in need, I have time and skills that could benefit other single mothers struggling like I was struggling a year ago." Her idea reflected the internalization of a philosophy Eduardo had shared about multiplying the impact of generosity by creating chains of mutual aid that transcended direct financial reimbursements toward building community support networks that strengthened the broader social fabric. "I'd love to hear what you're considering," Eduardo responded with genuine interest in seeing how Carmen would adapt the principles that had guided her own decision to help her to very different circumstances of limited resources but abundant willingness to contribute to the well-being of others facing similar challenges. "I was thinking I could start a small support group where single mothers in the neighborhood could meet weekly to share resources, exchange childcare, and learn from each other about navigating the economic and emotional challenges we face," Carmen explained with growing enthusiasm as she articulated a vision she had clearly been developing over weeks of reflection. And perhaps I could offer basic cooking training for those interested in developing skills that could lead to jobs in the food industry or even their own businesses eventually. Because I know from personal experience that having marketable skills makes an enormous difference in a single mother's ability to provide for her family with dignity instead of perpetually relying on charity or government programs that provide temporary relief but do not build capacity for long-term self-sufficiency. Her proposal articulated a sophisticated understanding of the difference between assistance that created dependency versus empowerment that built sustainable capabilities that allowed people to transform their own circumstances through the development of human and social capital that no amount of direct financial aid could fully replicate. Eduardo listened with growing admiration as Carmen outlined specific plans for a support group that would include not only sharing material resources but also building a network of emotional solidarity that could provide the psychological strength needed to persevere during difficult periods when social isolation frequently amplified material challenges by depriving single mothers of a community of peers who understood their experiences without judgment or condescension. What would it take to make this vision a reality? He asked, recognizing an opportunity to support an initiative that would multiply the impact of his original investment in Carmen's business by creating community infrastructure that would benefit dozens, if not hundreds, of families facing similar circumstances to those she had overcome through a combination of personal determination and timely assistance. Primarily, a meeting space that's cozy but large enough to comfortably accommodate 15 or 20 people, Carmen responded, clearly having thought carefully about the logistical requirements for effective implementation of her vision. And perhaps some basic resources like cookbooks, educational materials on personal finance and parenting, and modest funds to provide childcare during meetings so that mothers can participate without worrying about supervising their children while they are learning and connecting with others. Her list was pragmatic and modest, reflecting both a realistic understanding of financial limitations and creativity about how to maximize the impact of available resources through careful program design that addressed multiple needs simultaneously. I have vacant commercial property 3 blocks from here that has been unused for years, Eduardo immediately offered, acknowledging the perfect alignment between Carmen's project needs and the resources he currently possessed to no productive purpose. And I would be honored if you would use it at no cost to establish this support center, which would clearly provide immense value to the community in ways that my empty building certainly isn't currently achieving, as it simply gathers dust and depreciates in value. Her offer of free space removed the main obstacle to launching the initiative while allowing Carmen to maintain control over the direction and operation of a program that represented her vision and values, rather than becoming a mere implementer of a wealthy benefactor's ideas that could impose perspectives inconsistent with the real needs of the target population. The community center that Carmen established with Eduardo's support became, over the next year, a vital resource for 32 single mothers who regularly participated in programs that included job training, resource sharing, mutual emotional support, and educational activities for children that provided enrichment that many families could not afford through private commercial channels. The impact of this program greatly exceeds the modest investment required to establish it, observed social worker Maria Torres during an evaluation that documented measurable outcomes, including significant increases in employment rates among participants, reductions in reported psychological stress, and improvements in academic performance among children whose mothers had found stability through the support network the center provided. The quantitative data validated Carmen's original intuition that single mothers needed not only material assistance but also a supportive community that could provide emotional and practical resources to navigate the multifaceted challenges of parenting in difficult economic circumstances without the support of partners who traditionally shared parental responsibilities. Eduardo found that his participation in Carmen's project provided satisfaction that decades of conventional corporate philanthropy had never generated because personal involvement and direct relationships with beneficiaries created human connection that impersonal donations to large organizations could not replicate, regardless of the scale of financial impact. This project has taught me that true generosity is not primarily about money but about time, attention, and a willingness to build authentic relationships that honor the dignity of those you support rather than simply seeing them as passive recipients of patronizing charity. He reflected during an interview with a journalist covering a story about the transformation of a small coffee shop into a catalyst for broader community development. His articulation of lessons learned resonated with audiences who recognized the tension between conventional philanthropy, which maintained distance between donors and beneficiaries, versus participatory models that required personal investment but generated deeper satisfaction through genuine human connection. The second anniversary of the original loan that had saved Carmen's business was marked by an event at a community center where 30 program beneficiaries expressed gratitude not only to Carmen and Eduardo but also to each other for the mutual support network they had collectively built through commitments to attend regularly, generously share resources, and maintain confidentiality about personal struggles that were shared in an atmosphere of trust and non-judgment. I want to thank Eduardo Martinez for demonstrating by personal example that wealth comes with the responsibility of using resources to strengthen community rather than simply accumulating more for personal gain. Carmen said during a moving speech articulating how her life had been transformed over the 2 years since that rainy afternoon when a stranger had wandered into her coffee shop and had eventually become a dear friend and mentor whose generosity had catalyzed not only her own financial stability but a broader community movement that was improving the lives of dozens of families. But I also want everyone to know that although I still owe Eduardo 42,000 pesos on the original loan because my monthly payments have necessarily been small given my business's modest margins, she continued, her voice cracking with emotion as she reached a moment she had anticipated for months. I have kept meticulous records of every peso I owe and every payment I have made, because my mother taught me that integrity means honoring commitments even when no one else is pressuring you to fulfill them because it is the right thing to do regardless of circumstances or convenience. Her public reaffirmation of debt obligation was delivered with dignity that transformed what could have been a shameful admission of continued insolvency into a declaration of principles about personal honor and financial responsibility that defined her character regardless of limited material resources. Eduardo listened with tears streaming down his cheeks as he reflected on how a chance encounter 2 years earlier had evolved into a transformative friendship that had restored a sense of purpose that had been lacking since Elena's death, when work had been a refuge from grief but no source of genuine meaning. Carmen, there's something I need to tell you about that debt, Eduardo finally spoke as she finished her remarks, and the audience had applauded his commitment to financial integrity, which inspired admiration no matter how trivial the amount owed was to the multi-million-dollar lender. When I lent you that money 2 years ago, I included a clause in our agreement that I apparently failed to clearly mention in that moment of emotion when we were both processing an immediate crisis that urgently needed to be resolved. His preamble created suspense among the audience, who wondered what revelation was coming that required such careful context before any major articulation. The clause specified that your repayment obligation would be fully cancelled if, within 2 years, you had used the loan proceeds not only to stabilize your own business but to pay it forward by assisting others in similar circumstances of need. He explained as he pulled a document from his jacket that he had brought specifically for this moment of revelation he had carefully planned for weeks. And I believe the establishment of a community center that has benefited 32 families during the past year more than qualifies as fulfilling that condition, so I formally declare your debt fully paid and your financial obligation to me completely satisfied. His debt cancellation was handed over with a solemnity that communicated a seriousness of pronouncement while also revealing that he had been waiting for the appropriate moment to reveal a surprise that would transform Carmen's understanding of what her loan had truly meant from Eduardo's perspective. But Eduardo, I want to pay, Carmen immediately protested, her expression mixing relief at the elimination of financial obligation with frustration that her determination to honor the debt through full repayment had been preempted by the lender's unilateral decision. Because keeping my word on repayment was important to my sense of integrity and to demonstrate to my daughter that we keep commitments even when it's difficult or inconvenient because that's how honorable people behave regardless. of whether others are demanding compliance. Her objection reflected exactly the kind of character that had motivated Eduardo's original decision to help her, while creating a dilemma about how to respect her autonomy and values about financial responsibility while also implementing his own philosophy about paying it forward rather than simply back. "I completely understand," Eduardo responded, respectful of her feelings while remaining firm about his decision to cancel the debt because he recognized that Carmen had fulfilled the spirit of the agreement in ways that exceeded any financial repayment he could have eventually provided. "But what I am trying to explain is that I always saw this loan not as a conventional financial transaction but as an investment in your capacity to eventually help others in ways that would multiply the impact of my initial support far more effectively than simply returning 60,000 pesos to my bank accounts, where they would become an additional microscopic fraction of wealth that I no longer need or can significantly expend during my remaining lifetime." His explanation reframed the nature of their original agreement in a way that honored Carmen's commitment to integrity while validating that she had fulfilled her obligation through actions that transcended monetary repayment to the creation of social value, which was the very goal that had motivated her initial generosity, inspired by Don Rafael's example decades earlier. The revelation of the secret clause transformed Carmen's understanding of what her relationship with Eduardo had meant for 2 years while also providing a powerful lesson to Sofia and other program participants about alternative ways of thinking about debt, obligation, and responsibility that went beyond conventional transactional frameworks toward more complex understandings of reciprocity that operated through networks of community solidarity rather than simple bilateral exchanges. "So what you're saying," Carmen slowly processed as the implications of Eduardo's revelation sank into her understanding, "is that my obligation was never primarily financial but rather a moral one to use the benefit I received to benefit others in ways that would build a stronger community and extend the circle of generosity beyond the two of us toward a broader network of mutual support that could be sustained regardless of your continued participation." Her reframing captured the essence of Eduardo's philosophy about paying it forward while revealing that she had internalized lessons he had attempted to convey by example as much as by material resources. "Exactly." Eduardo confirmed with visible satisfaction that Carmen had grasped a fundamental point that Don Rafael had tried to teach him decades earlier when he was a young recipient of generosity that had transformed his life trajectory. "And I believe that Don Rafael would be proud to see how his philosophy has now been passed down through 3 generations of beneficiaries, whose lives have been enhanced not only through financial assistance but through modeling how to live generously and responsibly toward the community that transcends narrow self-interest." His invocation of his original mentor provided narrative continuity that connected his own transformation from grateful recipient to generous benefactor to Carmen's similar trajectory from beneficiary to community leader who was extending the circle of support through work that multiplied the impact of Eduardo's initial investment in ways that no financial reimbursement could match. Sofia watched the exchange between her mother and Eduardo with a growing understanding that she was witnessing a lesson about values and responsibility that would shape her own understanding of success and purpose in ways that formal schooling could rarely provide through abstract instruction divorced from lived experience and personal role modeling. "Mom, does this mean that your promise to repay Eduardo was fulfilled not with money but with help for all these families?" she asked with a clarity that characterized the insight of children not yet confounded by the complexities of adult thinking about economic transactions, and that this is a better way to repay because it helps more people instead of just returning money to someone who already has a lot? Her simple synthesis captured exactly the logic Eduardo had attempted to articulate in more elaborate ways that obscured a fundamental point through excessive verbal sophistication. "Yes, honey, exactly that," Carmen responded as she hugged her daughter with gratitude for the clarity she had brought to a complex moment through a direct question that penetrated to the essential truth. "And I hope you remember this lesson when you are an adult with your own resources to share, because the most powerful way to acknowledge help you receive is to pass it on to others who need support instead of simply trying to repay the original person who helped you." The explicit articulation of principle for Sophia's educational benefit ensured that the next generation would inherit a philosophy of community responsibility that had been passed down from Don Rafael to Eduardo to Carmen, and now to a girl whose life had been stabilized through generosity that her grandparents could recognize as a continuation of cultural traditions of social solidarity that economic modernization had progressively eroded over recent decades. The following years brought continued expansion of both Carmen's Café and the community center, which had evolved from a modest experimental project into a recognized institution attracting media attention, support from philanthropic foundations, and replication in other Mexico City neighborhoods where the need for support networks for single mothers was equally urgent. But resources were scarce and effective models difficult to identify without concrete examples of success to validate. Alternative approaches to conventional social assistance. The model Carmen developed has now been adapted in 7 different locations, reported network coordinator Patricia Gomez during a conference on innovation in social services, and results consistently demonstrate that the combination of emotional support, skill development, and resource sharing generates superior outcomes to programs that provide only financial assistance without building community capacity that enables participants to support each other in sustainable ways. The empirical data validated Carmen's original intuition about program design while providing evidence that could inform broader public policies on how governments and non-governmental organizations could more effectively support single-parent families facing multifaceted economic and social challenges. Eduardo found that his life had been transformed as profoundly as Carmen's through their friendship, which had evolved from an initial transactional encounter into a familial relationship of choice that filled an emotional void that wealth had never been able to resolve through the acquisition of material possessions or luxurious experiences that were superficially impressive but did not satisfy fundamental psychological needs for human connection and meaningful purpose. Carmen and Sophia have become the family I chose after losing my biological family. He explained during a reflective interview about the personal transformation he had experienced over the 5 years since a rainy afternoon when he had entered a small cafe seeking temporary shelter from the storm but finding instead a relationship that had restored a sense of purpose and joy he had believed permanently lost with Elena's death. His public acknowledgement of the emotional significance of his relationship with Carmen and Sophia challenged cultural narratives about philanthropy that typically emphasized unidirectional generosity from the rich to the poor while ignoring how benefactors frequently received psychological and spiritual benefits that exceeded any financial cost of their generosity. Eduardo's decision to modify his will to establish a permanent fund that would support the continued operations of the network of community centers that Carmen had inspired ensured that the legacy of his generosity would extend beyond his lifetime by institutionalizing a model that had proven effective in improving the lives of vulnerable families. I want this fund to honor the memory of 3 people who shaped my understanding of responsibility and generosity, Eduardo explained to attorneys structuring his will provisions. Don Rafael Sanchez, who taught me through personal example about paying it forward. My wife Elena, who shared my early struggles and celebrated successes before cancer took her too soon, and Carmen Ruiz, who reminded me of the purpose and meaning I had lost during years of chasing wealth, which became an end in itself rather than a means to a life well lived. His list of influences provided a personal narrative that connected present beneficence with past obligations and relationships that had shaped his character in ways that transcended the entrepreneurial achievements that financial circles typically emphasized when discussing the lives of wealthy individuals. The 50 million peso fund he established would generate approximately 4 million pesos annually in investment income that could support multi-center operations in perpetuity without relying on ongoing fundraising campaigns that consumed organizational energy and created uncertainty about the long-term sustainability of effective programs. This fund represents an attempt to institutionalize Don Rafael's philosophy of paying it forward in ways that will continue to benefit future generations long after both Carmen and I have passed away, Eduardo explained during an announcement ceremony that also recognized Carmen's contributions to the development of the model the fund would support. Because I believe the most meaningful legacy wealthy people can leave behind is not buildings bearing their names but community support systems that empower ordinary people to help each other in ways that build stronger social fabric and more equitable societies. His articulation of a philanthropic philosophy challenged conventional practices of wealthy donors, which frequently prioritized public recognition through the naming of buildings or programs over measurable effectiveness in addressing real social needs that rarely generated spectacular headlines but transformed everyday lives in profound and sustainable ways. The 10th anniversary celebration of Eduardo and Carmen's original meeting was marked by a gathering that drew more than 200 people whose lives had been touched, directly or indirectly, by a generosity that began with a 60,000 peso loan but multiplied through networks of solidarity built through consistent implementation of the pay-it-forward philosophy they had both embraced as a guiding principle. When I look around this room and see mothers who have found employment, children who are thriving in school, and the supportive community that has been built through a mutual commitment to helping one another, Carmen spoke during an emotional speech that summed up a decade of community transformation. I realized that the promise I made Eduardo 10 years ago to pay it forward when I could was fulfilled in ways neither of us anticipated at that moment of crisis, when we were both responding to immediate circumstances with no clear vision of how a simple act of generosity could catalyze a movement that would eventually benefit hundreds of families. Her reflection on the unpredictable trajectory of social impact generated by chance encounters provided powerful testimony to how individual acts of kindness could resonate through social networks in ways that far exceeded the original intentions or understandings of the initial participants. Eduardo taught me that true repayment of generosity is not a two-way financial transaction but rather the creation of a culture of reciprocity that spans multiple generations and geographic locations. She continued, gesturing to an audience that included original beneficiaries of the first center along with leaders from 6 additional locations who had replicated the model in other neighborhoods. And I hope that everyone in this room understands that you also have a responsibility to pay forward any benefit you have received by helping others in ways that build a stronger community, regardless of your personal financial resources, which may be limited but do not determine your ability to contribute meaningfully to the collective well-being. Her exhortation to the audience expanded the circle of responsibility beyond herself and Eduardo to all the participants who had benefited from the program, democratizing the philosophy of generosity in a way that did not depend on extraordinary wealth but instead recognized that everyone possessed resources of time, attention, skills, or knowledge that could be shared for mutual benefit. Eduardo listened with tears of gratitude as he reflected on how his life had been redeemed from the existential emptiness that had threatened to destroy his spirit for years after Elena's death, when the wealth he had accumulated had seemed not only useless but actively isolating, separating him from ordinary human experiences that provided texture and meaning to existence that money could not buy, regardless of the amount available. Carmen, when I met you 10 years ago, I was in the midst of an existential crisis that I didn't fully recognize but that had led me to wander aimlessly around the city searching for something I couldn't name, Eduardo shared during his own remarks that revealed a vulnerability he rarely expressed publicly about his inner life. And your promise to pay me back when you could was fulfilled 1,000 times over, not through financial reimbursement, but through the restoration of my sense of purpose and human connection that I had lost during years of chasing success that turned out to be far less satisfying than the friendship and community we'd built together. His acknowledgement that he had been both a beneficiary and a benefactor inverted conventional hierarchies of philanthropy while articulating the fundamental truth that genuine generosity created value for all participants rather than being a zero-sum game where donors sacrificed resources for the unilateral benefit of passive recipients with no capacity to reciprocate.